Well, good morning again. It's good to be here with you, and just thankful that you guys have chosen to worship with us Sunday after Easter. Sunday after Easter is tends to be the one of the lowest attended Sundays of the year. It's like they get the holiday out of their system, and it's like, oh, we're just going to go chill, enjoy the beautiful weather. But what we're doing this morning, I tried to convince you guys to come back for one more Sunday by continuing the Easter message. We started an Easter message last Sunday called Let There Be Life, and we talked a lot about the nature of the resurrection and what it means for us, how God embraces us in our own mess, and the mess of our lives. And this morning, what I wanted to kind of do is transition a little bit into more of a discussion about why we can believe in the resurrection. One of those things that's so easy to just assume that it's true. If you've been a churchgoer all your life, or if you've been to part of the hills for a little while now, we kind of just take it for granted that the resurrection is kind of the heart of the Christian calendar. It's kind of the reason why we do all that we do. It defines who we are. But perhaps you, or maybe somebody you know, or maybe maybe from time to time you yourself struggle with whether or not the resurrection actually is true. Maybe it's just a story made up. Maybe it's just a nice conclusion to the story about Jesus, maybe they just needed a good ending to overcome the sad ending of his death. Well, this morning we're going to take a look at a little bit of the evidence for why we can believe it, and why there's actually rational reasons to believe that Jesus actually came out of the grave, which is an amazing thing to say. But before we get to that, I want to tell you a story about a woman I know. There's this woman, her name is Lisa, and she has had a neighbor that she's lived next door to for a long time that she's been at odds with. For a long, long time she's been at odds with this neighbor, and things have just been bad. It doesn't matter what she does, it doesn't matter what she tries to do to fix the situation. It just seems like everything always gets worse. You probably had one of those neighbors before in your lifetime, where it's just like, for whatever reason, you're just on each other's nerves. And this particular neighbor was just really difficult for Lisa to deal with. Well, one morning, Lisa let her dog out to do his business, early in the morning, and not thinking much of it, she went about her morning routine. And when it came time to let her dog back in before she left to go to work that day, she nearly had a heart attack when she discovered that her dog wasn't in her yard. The gate had been left open, the dog had escaped, and it was who knows where. She looked all over her backyard, she couldn't find it. She looked around the front of the house, she couldn't find her dog. She looked up and down the street, she couldn't find her dog. But while she was walking up and down the street calling out his name, she faintly heard the sound of her dog in her neighbor's backyard. The last place in the world that this dog should be. So she quickly and quietly snuck around her neighbor's house to find her dog. And when she finally laid eyes on her dog, Lisa says her jaw nearly hit the floor. Her jaw nearly hit the ground because not only did she find her dog in her neighbor's yard, she found her dog with her neighbor's pet rabbit in its mouth. Not a good situation. She grabbed hold of the dog and dragged him with the blood-soaked rabbit still in his mouth and his jaws back into her garage. Lisa's neighbor had had this rabbit for a long, long time. This was his prized pet. This was an award-winning rabbit. This completely white, beautiful bunny that he's always talking about, always raving about. And now it lay motionless in her dog's jaws, soaked in blood. It was not a pretty sight. Scared and unsure what to do, Lisa decided to orchestrate a massive cover-up. She took the motionless, lifeless bunny and cleaned it up as best as she could. She wiped it as clean as she could wipe it. She scrubbed its fur as much as she could. She even took a little bit of white paint and covered some of the blood-soaked fur with white paint. Unbelievable. For over an hour, she says, she worked on this rabbit to make it look as good as new. Once she had it looking as unscathed as humanly possible, Lisa took the rabbit and quickly and quietly returned the rabbit to its pen in her neighbor's yard. She propped it up against the wall of the pen to make it appear like it had died of natural causes. This was the whole plan. She didn't want her dog to be the one to blame. She wanted the neighbor to think it just, I don't know, had a heart attack or something. I don't know, just died. Once the rabbit was all set up in the pen and everything looked as natural as could be, Lisa closed the pen door and nonchalantly walked back to her home like nothing had ever happened. A few hours later, Lisa's entire neighborhood likely heard the scream that emanated from her neighbor's backyard. In an attempt to, play it off as if she's as concerned and surprised as anybody would be to hear such a scream, Lisa came running from the back door of her house, asking her neighbor, "What's wrong? What's wrong? What happened?" She was shocked to see that her neighbor actually hadn't gone to the rabbit pen. He wasn't at the pen. He was actually in the middle of his yard, staring at the rabbit pen and screaming at the top of his lungs from the middle of his yard, just at the sight of the rabbit. Of course, this made Lisa think, well, I didn't do a very good job of covering up my dog's tracks. I must have missed a blood stain somewhere. But she continued to ask, saying, what happened? What's wrong? What happened? At that, her neighbor turned, and with a look of someone who had just seen a ghost, her neighbor exclaimed, "My rabbit! My rabbit! How can this be? My rabbit died 2 weeks ago. I buried him in the backyard. He's back! The rabbit's alive again! He's back from the dead!" Alright, so the story's not really true. I don't know what we orchestrated a massive cover-up with her neighbor's rabbit. But the story, again, being a sad attempt at me being humorous, is a parable of sorts. It's a parable about what we all know to be true. We all know, if we've been around this earth for more than a couple of years, we all know that if something that once was living ceases to live, it tends not to come back. Something that dies, or someone that dies, tends to remain dead. People just don't come back when their heart stops, when brain function ceases, when breathing ceases to happen, when breath is taken from our lungs. People tend not to come back from that. Living things of any kind tend not to come back with that. So when we read the story about a man who was dead, who was documented as being dead, clearly dead, when we read a story about this man coming back to life, it stands to reason that there would be people, maybe some people even here in this room this morning, who struggle to really acknowledge that, who struggle to really believe that, who struggle to really see how that could possibly be. How can somebody come back from the dead? It stands to reason why there would be people in our world who would question this claim. It just makes sense. If you don't question it, you're not really being honest, are you? Can this possibly be true? As the saying often goes, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And so the question for us this morning is there evidence to support this extraordinary claim? Is there extraordinary evidence to support this claim? It's true that being a follower of Jesus requires a certain amount of faith. That's true. Nothing I can say here this morning is going to give you all the evidence you ever needed for all mankind to ever need to believe once and for all that this man Jesus came out of the grave, came out of the tomb. If I could do that, then I wouldn't be probably standing here. I'd probably be in, I don't know, like Rome or something, and telling the world that you can no longer believe it's actually true, it actually happened. People ask, and people often wonder, if faith is nothing more than just a bunch of hopeless faith, a hopeless feeling, a hopeless pursuit, and an answer about what happens after death. People often question, say, I don't get this whole faith thing. She's really just a desperate emotional need for peace and resolution to help us cover for that void that is death. But in reality, our faith, unlike any other religion in the world, our faith actually has tangible evidence. Evidence that cannot be denied. Evidence that encourages our faith. That gives us something to stand on. And to say, you know what? This is true. This is true. Before we get into all the evidence, before we look at some of the claims about Jesus' resurrection from the dead. I want to actually read the story from Luke chapter 24 about Jesus' resurrection. Last week we looked at the story from Matthew's perspective. This morning I want to look at it from Luke's perspective. So we're going to read Luke 24, beginning in verse 35, all the way through the end of the chapter. This is what Luke has to say. The two from Emmaus told their story to the disciples of how Jesus had appeared to them as they were walking along the road, and how they had recognized him as he was breaking the bread. And just as they were telling them about it, Jesus himself was suddenly standing there among them. "Peace be with you," he said. But the whole group was startled and frightened, thinking they were seeing a ghost. "Why are you frightened?" he asked. "Why are your hearts filled with doubt? Look at my hands. Look at my feet. You can see that it's really me. Touch me and make sure that I am not a ghost, because ghosts don't have bodies, as you see that I do." As he spoke, he showed them his hands and his feet. Still, they stood there in disbelief, filled with joy and wonder. Then he asked them, "Do you have anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he ate it as they watched. Then he said, "When I was with you before, I told you that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled." Then he opened their minds to understand the Scriptures. And he said, "Yes, it was written long ago that the Messiah would suffer and die and rise from the dead on the third day. It was also written that this message would be proclaimed in the authority of his name to all the nations, beginning in Jerusalem. There is forgiveness of sins for all who repent. You are witnesses of all these things. And now I will send the Holy Spirit, just as my Father promised. But stay here in the city until the Holy Spirit comes and fills you with power from heaven." Then Jesus led them to Bethany, and lifting his hands to heaven, he blessed them. While he was blessing them, he left them and was taken up to heaven. So they worshipped him, and then returned to Jerusalem, filled with great joy. And they spent all their time in the temple praising God. One of my favorite authors is a man by the name of C.S. Lewis. Some of you probably heard of C.S. Lewis. And C.S. Lewis is famous for having said this. He says, "Christianity, if false, is of no importance. But if true, it's of infinite importance. The only thing that it cannot be is moderately important." If Jesus didn't rise from the grave, our faith is fruitless. Our faith is useless. There's really nothing to it. If this story isn't true, then it doesn't matter. But if it is true, if this thing did happen, as the gospel writers claim, as the disciples of Jesus claim, as hundreds and then thousands and then millions of people claim, if this thing actually happened, then it changes everything. It changes the world. It changes lives. And that's why it's important for us to really dig down deep and say, is there evidence for this? Is there something tangible here? If you were someone who heard this story about a man who was some rabbi or teacher, he's a miracle worker, his name was Jesus, and he was murdered. You hear about this guy? He was murdered, he was crucified on a cross, he was beaten, he died. He's dead. Fully, completely, and totally dead. And then you continue the story and you hear that this man came back to life. Well, that's a pretty radical statement, is it not? That's a pretty amazing statement. Not only do the disciples in this story in Luke claim to see Jesus after he was dead, they claim to be seeing Jesus in the flesh. You know, so it's one thing to say, you know, my grandmother died or my grandfather died, but I still see him from time to time. You know, it's kind of like that natural state of grieving. You still kind of see him, or you still kind of you hear him in your heart, or you maybe you're having a dream and your deceased loved ones kind of show up in your dreams and they speak to you. You know, there's that kind of thing. There's that kind of, like, maybe even a ghostly apparition thing, if you're the kind of person who believes in spirits and ghosts and things. There's that kind of claim. But then there's another claim completely. If I tell you that my grandfather showed up in my living room, and not only did he show up in my living room, he sat down at my table and he ate my fish. That's a completely different claim. Hallucinations and ghostly apparitions do not eat your broiled fish. They don't. They don't consume your food. They don't go through your cupboards and look for something to eat. One of my favorite parts of this entire story is where Luke tells us that the disciples are startled. They're still kind of frightened, but there's joy and wonder in their hearts. And Jesus says, "Do you have anything to eat?" One of my favorite parts of the entire story, because how human is that? Like, I'm back from the dead. I've been through a lot, guys. I'm kind of hungry. Like, there's a long trip. I'd like to kick my feet up and eat something. And one of my favorite verses is actually Luke 24, verse 43, where it literally, the entire verse says, "And he ate the fish while they watched him." That's the entire verse. They watched him eat. Could you imagine being in that room? This guy was dead, and now he's eating your fish. Yeah, I would dedicate an entire verse to that story about watching him eat. That would be an amazing thing to experience. I would probably make that entire paragraph about how it looked like he was eating. Like, what did that action look like? What was that experience like? Ghosts don't eat. Mass hallucinations don't eat your food. Hallucinations, or just nice memories of someone who is long gone, doesn't show you the wounds in their hands, the piercing of their side. They don't show you their body because they're not really there. But Jesus, according to this story, is actually there. And he's eating with them, which is such a powerful thing. Something we so often overlook. He's eating with them. As far as the New Testament writers are concerned, the disciples and the gospel writers and everyone in the New Testament, as far as they're concerned, Jesus is actually there. Which is where things get a bit complicated. Because according to traditional beliefs of the day, Jesus shouldn't be there. He shouldn't be there. Nobody at this time had any notion about somebody literally walking out of the grave on their own. Nobody's ever thought that. Back in the first century, even predating the first century, there was a popular Greek philosophy known as Epicureanism. I think I'm pronouncing that right. And it was established by a philosopher by the name of Epicurus. And Epicurus is a father of what many people believe even to this day about that once you die, you literally don't exist. You just kind of cease to exist. It's a cessation philosophy. You lose all sense of consciousness, you're just gone. It's a very depressing kind of philosophy, if you ask me. But during the first century, during the time of Jesus, throughout the Roman Empire, which included Jerusalem and all of Judea, one of the most famous epitaphs that would go on people's tombs was what came from Epicurus, this philosopher, who said this: "I was not, I was, I am not, I don't care." There was all this concern among many people that if you died, you would know that you were dead, you were like in some kind of pain or suffering. But though Epicurus kind of taught that, no, you lose consciousness, so you don't really care about anything anymore. And so people would literally write this on their tombs. This was a very popular epitaph around their tombs. "I don't care. I'm dead, I don't care." Very depressing. That was kind of the popular Grecian philosophy of the day. The Jewish philosophy, as we know, as we can at least assume, was based on and heavily influenced by the Old Testament. And in the Old Testament, the Jews were taught that there is life after death. There is eternal life. God said from the very beginning, from the very opening chapters of Genesis, that life is meant to be eternal. And so for the Jewish tradition, for the Jewish people, life eternal was a real thing. But in ancient Judaism, the thought was that when you died, you didn't just rise up from the tomb again, because people would be seeing you. What they believed was you go to this place called Sheol. And there was this spiritual, shadowy type ethereal existence where you lived among all the other dead, and you're kind of there, but not really, it's kind of a shadow of who you really were. And you existed eternally, at least until the next step, you existed in this place called Sheol. But then later on, in the books of Isaiah, the books of Ezekiel and Daniel, we start seeing these prophecies about that there would someday be a resurrection. The Old Testament has plenty of prophecies about a resurrection. But throughout Jewish tradition, it was believed that all of those who live in Sheol, all those who died before us, all those who exist in this kind of shadowy existence, they would all together, universally, corporately, come out of the grave and be part of the new kingdom God was establishing. So that was the belief, that you would die, you would go to this spiritual world, and then you would rise from the dead later on with everybody else, participating in this resurrection, and you would all exist together in God's new kingdom. Among the two major philosophies of the day, the Grecian philosophy, which is just kind of like you die, you don't exist anymore, and the Jewish philosophy, which said that you went to Sheol and then you resurrected with everybody else, there is no room in any of those philosophies for an idea that one man, one person, would come out of the tomb on their own. There was no notion of that whatsoever among the first century thinkers, among the first century believers, especially among the Jewish religious elite. This was not something on their radar. And so this should not have happened. This was not something people were expecting. I don't know if you saw the first episode of that new show, AD. Anyone see that? Anyone tuned in on that? Nobody? A few of you did? My biggest criticism, it's been a good show so far, my biggest criticism so far is the first episode is you see the disciples talking about this idea that they were anticipating Jesus' resurrection. That they were kind of sitting back saying, well, a few of them were like, he said he would rise again from the dead in 3 days, so we're waiting to see that. I really question that because they really didn't get it. Jesus talked about it, and we can see him talking about through the Gospels, but they really didn't, it didn't sink in as fully as the people, the producers of that show, led you to believe. Because this was such a radical idea. This was not an Orthodox Jewish idea. This was not something that was supposed to happen. If anybody was going to rise from the dead, it was going to be all the Jews at one time. It was not going to be a single rabbi. It was not going to be a single man. And so when Jesus dies, they literally think he's dead. He's gone. He must exist somewhere in Sheol, and he's not the Messiah that they anticipated he would be. Everything was lost. Until all of a sudden he shows up again. And this story seemingly comes out of nowhere. If you were going to make up a story to encourage people to continue following the teachings of Jesus, if you were going to make up a story about, kind of giving a happier ending to the tragedy of Jesus' death, chances are you would have said something like, oh, we saw his spirit. He came back from the spirit, the world of Sheol, and he told us to continue on with his teachings, and he'll be part of the resurrection at the end of days. That would have been the story they would have written, because there's precedent for that. We see that in the Old Testament. If you ever want to read a great story about a ghost showing up on the scene, read the story from 1 Samuel, I think it's chapter 28. Great story about the prophet Samuel coming back from the dead. But again, it's only a ghostly apparition. So there's biblical precedent for this idea that Jesus could have shown up as just a spirit, kind of shadowy thing. But they are very specific in saying that Jesus was physically there. He ate with us. He ate Peter's fish. He's probably halfway finished with that fish, and Jesus ate it. Jesus took it and ate it from him. He was literally there. That's not something a respectable Jewish person would teach. That's not something a respectable Jewish person would go out telling others about. It's something that would be outright rejected. And it was outright rejected. In fact, when the disciples started talking about Jesus resurrecting from the grave, we get this reference in Matthew chapter 28 about how the Jewish leaders tried to actually distort the story and say, no, this isn't possibly true. In Matthew 28, we hear Matthew saying some of the guards went into the city and told the leading priests about what had happened, meaning that Jesus was no longer in the tomb. And a meeting with the elders was called, and they decided to give the soldiers a large bribe. They told the soldiers, you must say Jesus' disciples came during the night while they were sleeping, and they stole his body. If the governor hears about it, we'll stand up for you, so you won't get in trouble. So the guards accepted the bribe and said what they were told to say. Their story spread widely among the Jews, and they still tell it today. I love this reference because it tells us that even the religious leaders of the day didn't know how to explain that Jesus' body, his physical body, was no longer in the tomb. That he actually walked out of that tomb. That he was actually alive. They couldn't possibly explain it because it would have. If the disciples had gone out into Jerusalem and said Jesus is risen from the grave, all they had to do was show up and go check out the tomb, drag out his body, and say, no, he's right here. But they couldn't do that, so they made up this conspiracy theory about where he went. I love that, because it tells us that this is inexplicable. This wasn't supposed to happen. And they're already trying to stop it. They're already trying to do all they can to convolute the story. There was nothing to be gained for the disciples. by making up this ridiculous story that nobody would have thought of at the time. That everybody would have thought it was just it was heretical. It was anti-orthodox. It did not go along with the Jewish teachings of the day. There was nothing to be gained. There was no money to be made. There was no power trip. There was no opportunity for them. There was no position for them to say what they were saying. If anything, saying what they said and coming out with a story and going public with it only made life more difficult for them. It only made life more dangerous for them. In fact, we know from the rest of history, we know through the rest of the story that the disciples would go on to suffer greatly because of this testimony. They would go on, many of them would be brutally murdered because of the story that they're telling. So I don't know about you, but I don't know a whole lot of people who are willing to be killed for a lie. I really don't know a whole lot of people who are willing to be tortured to tell something, to continue a story that they made up. Another great piece of evidence I want to make sure we don't miss out on, that many times we overlook, is the source of the news that Jesus is alive. The original source of the news that Jesus was alive came from a very peculiar place. It did not come from the source that most people would have considered reliable. It did not come from a source that most people would have considered trustworthy. The original story, the original claim that Jesus had risen from the grave came from a bunch of women. And I know that sounds offensive for me to say that right now to you, to say that it was considered unreliable and untrustworthy. But that's how the first century Jews thought of women. Luke tells us in verse 24, it was Mary Magdalene, it was Joanna, it was Mary the mother of James, and several other women who told the apostles what had happened. But the story, listen to this part, the story sounded like nonsense to the men, so they didn't believe it. When Jesus first appears after his resurrection, he comes and he appears before a group of women. And to the first century believers, to the first century Jews, this was nonsense. Literally, Luke says it. This was nonsense. If somebody murdered somebody else, if I went and I murdered somebody, and I'm living in first century Judea, and the only witness was a group of women, I am not guilty of murder. Because those women are not allowed to testify in court. They're considered unreliable, they're considered untrustworthy, and they're also considered to be prone to fanciful stories, as some of the ancient Jewish scholars wrote. They're prone to fanciful stories. And it was incredibly offensive to our ears today. But that's what they believe. And so if I'm a first century disciple of this man named Jesus, and I'm looking for a story to continue on this idea that following Jesus is a new religion or a new faith, that you should, even though he died, you should still believe in him, I am not going to write the story and include women as the first messengers of that testimony. The women would not be in my story at all. They may just be kind of tertiary, they're kind of in the background, secondary characters in the background, they just kind of happen to be there. But Luke and Mark and Matthew and John tell it as it happened. They didn't care about the consequences. They said you can believe us or not, but it was women who first saw him. Again, something that went way against common Jewish belief. This is not something you make up. This is not a story that is going to be believed by the masses if you just kind of made it up as you were going. They simply told it as it happened. And they said, like it or not, it was these women who first saw him. Powerful piece of evidence that we so often overlook. Powerful piece of evidence. It also tells us a lot about Jesus' God's view of women and the equality of men and women, but we don't need to go there today. It's a powerful statement there. Finally, I want to wrap this up before we're here. We could talk about evidence all day long, but the last piece of evidence I want to share with you that really motivates me to firmly believe that this story is true comes from the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul, about 15 or so years later after Jesus' resurrection, he wrote this to the church in Corinth in his first letter to them. He says, Jesus was seen by Peter and then by the 12. After that, he was seen by more than 5,000. This should be 500. There's too many zeros in that. More than 500 of his followers at one time, most of whom are still alive. Some of you know that, and for those of you who are visiting here this morning, I'm going to embarrass myself right now, so just kind of put it out there. Some of you, most of you who've been here for a little while remember that I was on the show Finding Bigfoot once. And in that story on Finding Bigfoot, I said I was with 4 people who had this experience, and this is what happened to us. And they still alive. And those 3 other people are still alive. Had one of those people that I was with that day, that experienced what I experienced, come forward and said, nah, Tom's just making the story up. No, it didn't happen like that. No, he's kind of distorting reality. No, we don't remember it quite like that. If even one of those people said that, my story would be worthless, my credibility would be worthless, my integrity for the rest of my life would be ruined. You don't write to a bunch of people in a church in a major city that there are 500 people who saw and interacted with the resurrected Lord, if it's not true. If you write, and it's one thing to say, 500 people saw him and they're all dead, so you just have to trust me on that. That's one thing. But to say that most of them are still alive today, you can actually go and verify my story with them. 500 people, if even one of those people says, no, we kind of had this conspiracy theory and we kind of made this whole thing up and we're really trying to promote this new religion and we're trying to become powerful and rich, the entire faith group, the entire movement of Christianity would be ruined. If even one of those people that Paul cites here said that wasn't quite how it happened. But Paul is so convinced, so wrapped up in the reality of what he experienced as an apostle and what these other 500 disciples experienced by seeing the risen Lord themselves. He's so convinced by it that he boldly says, there's about 500 folks who can attest to what I'm talking about here. You can't write that unless it's true. It ruins the entire testimony if it's not. It ruins the entire story if it's not. And the entire movement that Paul is trying to get started, all the churches he's been trying to plant, this gospel he's been trying to preach, everything that he's been doing for the past 15 or 20 years, everything he's been doing would be ruined. It would all be ruined if that claim is not true. There's other evidence that we could talk about. There's prophecies that were fulfilled. There's anecdotal evidence from other non-biblical writers that we can look at. But we have a limited time on Sunday morning. And my idea for you this morning was just to give you a taste that there is actual evidence that this story is not just some fanciful, desperate hope that there's life after death. My conviction was when I started writing the Easter series this past 2 Sundays, the messages we'll be talking about. My concern was that a lot of people, people base decisions on one of 2 things. Either they lean more towards the emotional side or lean more towards like the logical, rational side. And so when I was writing these messages, I was wrestling with trying to put both into one. But as I was writing it dawned on me that there was just too much for one message. And so I decided, one message we're gonna focus on that whole emotional argument. We're gonna focus on the fact that God said that we can't help ourselves anymore, that we can't right the wrongs, we can't clean up our own mess, we can't fix the world because it's been just too far damaged, and there's no way we can rescue ourselves from our own curse of death. And so we talked a lot about the kind of emotional side, about why it was important to know that Jesus rescues us in the midst of our own death. And he embraces us in the midst of our own mess. And he says it's okay. You don't have to fix it anymore. I fixed it. Let there be life. And then this morning, my hope was to just give you a little taste that it's not just an emotional argument. It's not simply based on hopeless emotion. There's some rational reason that went into the disciples choosing to march to their own death, beating the drum that Jesus rose from the grave. They're willing to be stoned for it. They're willing to be beheaded for it. They're willing to be crucified for it themselves. Because it's true. Because it's true. You don't go to the grave for a lie. You simply don't. The band can come back up. We're going to go ahead and close out here. But The only question that remains then is if, in fact, this story is true, then it must mean that everything Jesus had to say and everything that Jesus did was also true. Including John chapter 14, verse 6, where Jesus says very explicitly, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. The evidence doesn't lie. Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus did come out of that grave, which can only mean one thing. He is the only way. He is the only truth. And He is the only source of life. He is worth following. He's worth worshiping. And He's worth sharing with the world. Let's close the word.